Good afternoon to everybody, good evening, good morning, wherever you might be joining us today. My name is Helen McDowell and I head up Government Affairs and Global Public Health at ViiV Healthcare, and I'm here today as the industry co-chair of the Industry Liaison Forum. It's my pleasure to open this second roundtable in our series, focusing on service delivery optimization to ensure the sustainability of the HIV response. And this roundtable in this series on long-acting products is done in collaboration with the Medicines Patent Pool. So this second roundtable will present the landscape of widely implemented differentiated service delivery models, looking at both HIV prevention and treatment. We'll look at and outline key considerations from a service delivery perspective that need to be considered in the development and implementation of long-acting formulations and the associated delivery platforms. We'll hear perspectives from communities, civil society, and frontline providers as to what is required to better enable the introduction of new long-acting technologies within the service delivery systems available. Now, before we get started, a few pieces of housekeeping to keep us on track. The first one, this roundtable is being recorded, and the recording will be made available to all participants and on the IAS website as part of the materials that are coming out of this series in the coming weeks. By staying in the meeting, this is acting as consent to being recorded for the portion of the roundtable. Secondly, we encourage active participation. We'd love you to send your questions to our presenters in at any time using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. I think we're all familiar with that on the different platforms, so please do send those in. We will aim to address them during the panel discussion and throughout the roundtable. The third ask, we know that we generally have a very active group of participants in these roundtables. We ask you to remember to focus your questions on today's roundtable theme. The questions about access will be covered in more detail during the third roundtable discussion. So finally, before we get started, I would like to emphasize that the ILF aims to provide stakeholders that are involved in the HIV response from all different perspectives with a neutral platform. The intent is to foster dialogue and action along the cascade through prevention, diagnosis and care. We might not find all the answers to the challenges today, but it is an important step forward, and we really look forward to having a very open and good discussion with all of those on the call today to try and see if we can make some progress forwards. Now, before we start into the first session, I would pass the mic to Anton Pozniak, my co-chair, if he's managed to get online. I don't know, Nelly, has Anton made it on?
Yes, Anton should be with us now.
Oh, hi everyone. I'm Anton Pozniak and I'm the immediate past president of the IAF, and I'm a physician at the Chelsea Westminster Hospital, and I'm the non-industry co-chair of the ILF. So I apologise for all my, they're the more public anyway. So it's a pleasure to be here today to explore and discuss all the opportunities and challenges ensuring an accelerated access to long-acting HIV technologies. I'd like to welcome all the participants and our guest presenters who are shown on the screen. So their presentations will be followed by a panel discussion where you'll be able to discuss current challenges in service delivery, differentiation and integration that be addressed by long-acting formulations and delivery platforms in more detail. So we've got a packed agenda today, and we've lost some time because of me, I'm sorry. So we kindly ask all the speakers to please not go over there a lot of time slots, so we can have more discussion at the end. Now, all the detailed biographies can be found throughout the bit.ly link that'll be pasted by the IAS colleagues in the chat shortly, so you can read all about the presenters who are on this program today. And with that, I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, Wim van der Velde, who's a liaison officer of GMP Plus and Industry Liaison Forum member, and he's going to provide us with a quick recap of what was discussed during session 1. Over to you, thanks.
Yes, thank you very much, Anton. I hope you can see me, hear me. So welcome everyone. Earlier this month, the first session in this series framed and presented an overview of the long-acting formulations and delivery platforms for HIV prevention and treatment that are currently available and in development. The first speaker at the first session, and also a dear friend, Michelle Rodolphe from WHO in Switzerland, started her presentation with an overview of the WHO PrEP-related recommendations that exist to date. Then she briefly touched on how WHO is planning to release the recommendations on long-acting cabotegravir, or CAP-LA, for HIV prevention at AIDS 2022. There are several unanswered questions that are currently being assessed, such as, first, data to include sex workers, people who inject drugs, and trans people, given the alternative muscle injection sites for people with buttock implants. Second, also, what are the expected models of delivery? And thirdly, can CAP-LA be delivered within existing programs, such as PrEP programs, key population services, sexual and reproductive health services, or other? We then heard perspectives from our community and civil society colleagues that raised 5 very important themes. Firstly, the development of new drugs provides clients with better diversity of options. To stay ahead of the virus, we need a constant investment in the development of new formulations and increase the range of options for clients who otherwise might struggle with traditional pill-based formulations or the pill burden itself. Secondly, clients want usability and accessibility of the long-acting technologies to all groups of populations, including adolescents, pregnant and breastfeeding women, and people living with comorbidities. Allowing clients to self-administer the injectable to avoid frequent clinical visits to a trained healthcare worker will be very welcome. Thirdly, the frequent visits to the healthcare facility incurs a cost to the client in rural settings, especially when talking about transport and time costs. Current models of care allow someone in the community to pick up ARVs on behalf of the clients, and this should be considered for long-acting formulations as well. This is also the theme for today's roundtable that we aim to dissect in more details. Fourthly, communities need to be put at the center of the response. Given the novelty of long-acting formulations, people in low and middle income countries know very little about these drugs, which will affect their demand and optimal adherence. By providing communities with treatment education, the so-called sabotagers will be unable to spread any myths or misconceptions that could increase client hesitancy and prevent a smooth rollout. And lastly, the only way we can entice funders and programmers to purchase these formulations for general populations is by showing the cost effectiveness of importing these formulations. From there, the session earlier this month dived into the more scientific portion of the roundtable, where Charlie Flexner presented an overview of the pipeline of long-acting agents in development for treatment and prevention. He introduced 5 different delivery platforms. Firstly, the long-acting oral ARVs, where we were giving the example of islatravir due to its extraordinary potency and long half-life in both the oral weekly version, the weekly version for treatment and the oral monthly version for PrEP. However, Merck had to pause the development of islatravir due to participants experiencing lymphopenia. Secondly, Charlie presented on implantable ARV, which is a silicone scaffold with pores that delivers tenofovir alafenamide, or TAF, at a slow rate. This implant can be used for HIV as well as a hepatitis B virus, making it doubly interesting as a potential product. However, in animal studies, the implant produced severe local toxicity, which is believed to be related to the daily release rate of this drug, given that implants released TAF slowly created low levels to no toxicity. Third example was subcutaneous ARVs, was lenacapavir, or LEN, for which Gilead has requested regulatory approval based on the results of the Capella study. Participants in the study are now receiving LEN every 6 months in subcutaneous doses. Because the drug has an exceedingly long half-life, it has a requirement for an oral loading dose to be given over 2 weeks, followed by a subcutaneous maintenance dose every 6 months. Therefore, implementation of this formulation might be more complicated. There are several broadly neutralizing monoclonal antibodies currently also in clinical development as intravenous ARVs. And lastly, transdermal ARVs, which is a patch device that is pressed into the skin so the microneedles enter the subdermal space, Nanoformulated drugs are deposited in viable skin layers and provide sustained release and absorption. We then heard from 3 industry partners on their clinical development in progress. Alex Reinhardt presented the ViiV healthcare portfolio. As we all know, the first FDA approval for kappa-LA prevention was provided in December 2021 already. Now ViiV will be working on more concentrated formulations of kappa-LA in combinations with other agents to deliver larger quantities of drugs over longer dosing intervals. Kathleen Squires from Merck provided a couple of confidential updates with regards to islatravir. And Martin Ree from Gilead presented the findings from Capella and Calibrate studies, where clinical data showed the efficacy and safety of lenacapavir in combination with other agents. Finally, Gustavo Doncel opened the panel discussion with his presentation on challenges and opportunities associated with development of long-acting formulations. The panel discussion raised the following themes by the industry partners: the challenges in the R&D process and novelty of long-acting formulations. For instance, the manufacturing process of long-acting injectable formulations is more complicated and expensive than traditional oral formulations. This potential challenge needs to be looked at urgently in order to move these formulations into the generic marketplace in low and middle income countries. There is a need for upfront investment in new manufacturing lines to create parenteral long-acting formulations, rather than taking an existing manufacturing line for a pill and switching it over to another kind of pill. Trial design is also more complex due to the nature of the agent. It takes longer to see the results from long-acting agents. Finding a good agent that is potent enough to be dosed less frequently is also difficult. And lastly, there is no regulatory precedent to follow, given the novelty of the formulations and delivery platforms. This is an uncharted path for regulators and innovators when submitting applications to regulators. This might delay the rollout of the formulations to the market. All in all, it was a very rich first session, which I hope will help to frame the next 2 roundtable discussions, which will start now. The third part of the roundtable discussion next month will explore in detail the access challenges to long-acting formulations. But I would be remiss if I did not already briefly mention, before concluding, the ongoing advocacy campaign by over 200 community and civil society organizations from the global South mostly, led by the African Community Advisory Board, AfroCAP, who was represented on the panel during the first session by Kenley Siegfried. In a nutshell, the campaign is calling upon ViiV to immediately license kappa-LA to generic manufacturers to ensure its affordable and widespread access in low and middle income countries. The community groups are asking ViiV to urgently update the access plans for kappa-LA using the dolutegravir license agreement and geographic scope as the absolute minimum, while also ensuring the licensing process with generic manufacturers is open and transparent. So without further ado, over to you, Anton and Helen, for the second session of this roundtable.
Thanks, Wim. Really appreciate that great overview of the first roundtable of the series. And I am now going to hand over to and introduce Anna Grimsrud, who is a Senior Technical Advisor at the IAS. And Anna is going to provide us with an overview of differentiated service delivery for HIV prevention and treatment. Anna, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Helen. Thanks, Anton. I just want to make sure you can see me and hear me and see my slides.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So I'm really excited to talk today about service delivery within the context of long-acting formulations and platforms. And what I'm going to do is outline for both treatment and for prevention where we are in terms of scaling up access. In the instances of prevention, I'm going to talk about PrEP. I'm also going to give an overview of the current relevant WHO guidance and outline where the challenges are. So from here, I'll speak a little bit about the role of long-acting formulations and platforms and what challenges they could address. I'm going to start with some basics around differentiated service delivery, and I just want to acknowledge that for some of you, this might be very much a review, and for others, this might be new content, so please just stick with me. I also want to state up front that I'm not a clinician, I'm not a track A person by nature, but really my work and interest is around service delivery and more broadly around operationalizing guidance and having guidance be implemented. So that's why we're here today in the service delivery part of the series. All right, so what is the current standard of care and how are people living with HIV currently accessing their HIV treatment? Here you can see the HIV care cascade from 2015 to 2020. So you've got the number of people living with HIV, those who know their status, those who are on treatment, and those who are virally suppressed. In 2020, there were 27.5 million people on treatment, and an additional 700,000 people started ART by the middle of 2021. Also, and importantly, of those on antiretroviral therapy, 90% are suppressed, and this equates to 2/3 or 66% of all people living with HIV being virally suppressed. This is the 390s shown in another way and looking at where we are globally in 2020. So 84% of people knew their status, 73% were on treatment, and as I just mentioned, 66% were suppressed. And you'll see here that there are gaps. With 3 million people, they knew their status but weren't on treatment, and nearly 5 million people globally are not suppressed. It's important to note that these figures are for all populations, but we do observe lower rates of viral suppression among specific groups, including young people, both children and adolescents. Men compared to women have lower rates of viral suppression, and key populations, including gay men and other men who have sex with men, trans people, people who inject drugs, sex workers, and people in prisons and other closed settings also having lower rates of viral suppression. These gaps, both absolute and relative, have changed over time with better access and uptake of HIV testing, along with better formulations. And so in this graph, you can see that the distribution of people living with HIV year on year, and compared to 5 years ago, more people today are on treatment and are suppressed. You can see that that red bar gets larger. The time to knowledge of status is being reduced. And we see that there's this constant proportion of people represented here in pink. So they're on treatment, but they're not suppressed. So I want to talk about differentiated service delivery now. And what I want to say is that, since 2016 and WHO's guidance, they added a new chapter in this guidance on service delivery, which was at the time, chapter 6. And this was about not just what to start and when to start, but also how to deliver treatment. This chapter 6 was a big deal because it really acknowledged the diverse needs of people living with HIV and divided them into 4 groups that required specific clinical packages of care. And this was a marked shift away from the one-size-fits-all approach that we'd seen to providing treatment up until this point. These new guidelines gave recommendations to support further task shifting and decentralization of services. And in particular, they outlined who could qualify for being stable or being virally suppressed and established on treatment and access differentiated service delivery. Here is a commonly used definition of differentiated service delivery, which really puts the person at the center. It acknowledges that we need to simplify and adapt services across the cascade, and that this can have benefits both for people living with or vulnerable to HIV, but also that we need to reduce unnecessary burdens on the healthcare system. And the original ideas behind differentiated service delivery were both that a one-size-fits-all approach wasn't working for people living with HIV and also wasn't necessarily working for the healthcare workers. So here you can see some examples of quotes in red from recipients of care saying, how am I going to keep my job if I have to spend a month a day at the clinic? Or why must I queue to see a nurse when all I need is a refill? And then from the healthcare worker perspective, these challenges of seeing people who were established on treatment when they have more complex people that require more intensive counseling and support. And really just the reality that the treatment cohort needed to be doubled with really the same resources. So when WHO put out this guidance in 2016, they defined what was then known as stable on ART, saying that people needed to be on treatment for at least a year and have 2 consecutive suppressed viral loads in order to be eligible for these models. And at this time, people who were pregnant and breastfeeding were not eligible. Now, as I mentioned, there was packages of care defined for different clinical groups of people living with HIV, but we also needed to understand that service delivery should be adapted beyond just these clinical characteristics, that we should also consider the context in which people live and the needs of specific populations. And these are what we call the elements. Now, sorry, just hitting next. It's with these building blocks, or the when, where, who, and what, that different DSD models were adapted. When being the frequency, where being the location of services, who in this instance being the provider, and what being the package that they would get. And these building blocks also allow us for different programs to be described using the same nomenclature, and then it makes it easier for us to compare and contrast what different implementers are doing and what different countries are doing. Really important is that we define the building blocks differently for ART refills, for clinical consultations, and for psychosocial support. And this splitting into different types of visits has been really fundamental. The separation, particularly of drug delivery from clinical care, is also emphasized by PEPFAR in their COP guidance. And it's important because you can think that there are many different locations where someone could potentially collect a medication refill compared to the type of provider in the location where you might get a clinical consultation. So just by way of example, you'll see here in Zimbabwe, there's community ART refill groups, and these are groups of people living with HIV, and they meet in the community and they take turns collecting antiretroviral therapy refills for each other. In this example, they can get refills of up to 6 months, and then on an annual basis, they will have a clinical consultation with a clinician, in this case, a nurse, at a primary healthcare facility. And so this is, again, this kind of template way of describing differentiated models of service delivery for antiretroviral therapy. Last year, WHO updated their consolidated guidelines, and they revised their definition of established on treatment. And much of this was based on research, including implementation science from adaptations that were made during COVID-19, and highlighted that service delivery options should be given sooner in the treatment journey, and this could be beneficial for everyone. Important to these changes was that all populations, regardless of their regimen or their age, regardless of whether or not they were pregnant or breastfeeding, as well as children and adolescents, and then those with chronic comorbidities that were controlled, they could also access these sorts of models. And so here's a table from WHO that summarizes these changes. And here you'll see there's a shift in language from stable to established on ART, a reduction in time on ART required before eligibility, and a change in terms of how we can look for evidence of treatment success to being one suppressed viral load. WHO also has recommendations for the other building blocks for HIV treatment as well. So for the when, they recommend that those who are established on ART can be offered preferably 6-month ART refills and clinical visits. For where, ART services can be decentralized, and we now have recommendations that include the initiation outside of health facilities, as well as maintenance and support and refills happening at the community level. In terms of who, again, in this case, the provider, there's task sharing recommendations that allow for initiation and maintenance to non-clinicians, midwives, and nurses, and a recommendation that community health workers can dispense treatment and lay providers can distribute a treatment. PEPFAR has gone beyond the WHO recommendations in regards to multi-month dispensing, or MMD, and this is something that they did during COVID-19 in order to ensure uninterrupted access. And here you'll see that all of these populations are eligible for multi-month dispensing, which according to PEPFAR is refills of 3 months or longer. And so people right from initiation, people with advanced HIV disease, people who aren't suppressed, people with comorbidities, all of them can access multi-month dispensing. With PEPFAR data, we can also look at the huge scale up that we've seen in multi-month dispensing in the past 2 years. And over 10 million people in PEPFAR supported countries are now receiving multi-month dispensing. And this is a doubling from 5 million at the end of 2019. If we go into more detail here on the dispensing data, you'll see here that from 21 countries supported by PEPFAR, this is most of their countries, but does exclude South Africa, the proportion of those receiving multi-month dispensing increased from 49% to 79% between October 2019 and September 2021. So blue is those on 3 to 5 month refills, and red is those on 6-month refills. So by September of last year, 3.8 million people were receiving 6 months of ART refills, and an additional 6.2 million were receiving 3 to 5 months of ART at a time. It's also really important to note that this increase in access to multi-month dispensing has also been seen for children and adolescents. So here's that same graph again, and this is for those under the age of 15. So by September of 2021, 59% of children and adolescents in these 21 PEPFAR supported countries were receiving at least 3 months of treatment at a time. Further, PEPFAR data shows that while they've scaled multi-month dispensing, and this you can see in gray, there has not been a negative impact or a change on their viral load coverage and their viral load suppression data. So the blue dots are viral load coverage and the red are suppression. We know there might be some confounding here due to COVID-19 in terms of access to viral load testing, but it's important to say that we think that multi-month dispensing is not going to be have a negative impact, but have no impact or be beneficial for some people. So along with their guidance, WHO also talks about 4 different models of DSD for HIV treatment. This includes group models, and those can be facilitated by the healthcare worker or by people living with HIV on the top, and then individual models that can take place either at a health facility or at communities. And what we see within some of these community individual models is a huge diversity in what these include. So we see examples of community pharmacies and private pharmacies. We see examples of home delivery. We see examples of locker systems. We see examples of where you can collect treatment from drop-in centers, community-based organizations, KP-led services, etc. And so we've really seen a proliferation of what we mean here when we say individual models out of facility. Now, if we look at country policies related to DSD, this is one of our policy dashboards. And here you can see countries down the vertical axis and the duration of ART refills that are allowed in policy. In teal are their national policies, and in orange are policies that were put in place during COVID. So on the left, you've got countries with less than 3 months dispensing, and on the right, those who allow 6 months. And you can see that there's a lot of countries that are now aligned with WHO in terms of offering 3 to 6 month dispensing, and that many countries were kind of nudged in this direction during COVID-19. Here's a similar dashboard for clinical consultations, and with 3 monthly clinical consultations on the left, all the way to annual on the right. And you'll see that a few countries now are starting to recommend annual clinical consultations for those established on treatment. And I want to talk a little bit specifically about South Africa in this regard. So in South Africa, during COVID, the government extended ART prescriptions. So they allowed prescriptions to be extended from 6 months to 12 months in order to support uninterrupted access to treatment. And this data here is from our Central Chronic Medicines Dispensing and Distribution Program, or CCMDD. And you'll see that there is 1.5 million scripts written for 12 months. In red are those who are on treatment only. In gray, those who are on antiretroviral therapy and another non-communicable disease treatment. And in blue, those on other NCD meds. And so I just want to highlight here that in South Africa, there's 1.2 million people living with HIV, some with other chronic comorbidities, who were only seen on an annual basis. We also know that there are more and more countries that are supporting group and community-based group models. And so that's really exciting and something that we see happening. And then from a community models perspective, that the majority of countries that we look at really do have policies in place for both facility and community models of antiretroviral therapy. So the question today to this group is really, we want to make sure that with long-acting technologies and platforms that we're not re-burdening the health system, or we're not sending people back to health services potentially more often than the current standard of care, because we already know we have a high volume of people at health facilities. And so we need to think about the differentiated service delivery component when we look at long-acting for treatment. So if the majority of people are coming to health facilities every 6 months, how can we make sure that long-acting doesn't increase the patient volume at facilities? Just quickly, one of the common challenges is that we do see that people who are established on antiretroviral therapy come back to health facilities for other prevention needs or for other chronic conditions. So for example, we see that non-communicable disease drug refills are not integrated, but could be. And we also know that this is a challenge for contraceptive care commodities. So in a review that we've done looking at countries with DSD for HIV treatment models, you'll see that there's both a large unmet need for contraceptive care, but that also a high number of women in these countries are using injectable contraceptive methods. And so you can imagine that in order for them to access these injectable methods, they're coming to the health facility more regularly for contraceptive care than they are for their antiretroviral therapy. And so we need to look at ways of integrating and aligning those. So to summarize in treatment, we know that most people living with HIV in sub-Saharan Africa are receiving at least 3 months of antiretroviral therapy and often coming to health facilities every 6 or 12 months only. And that this is part of this larger shift to longer refills and annual clinical consultations that will align with viral load monitoring. And then finally, we know that there's real efforts and interests in bolstering and ensuring community-based and group models of treatment. All right, so what about PrEP? Here's the most recent data I can find from UNAIDS on PrEP scale up, and I'm acknowledging that this is a little bit old, but unfortunately where treatment managed to meet its 2015 target ahead of schedule, we know that in 2020 we didn't meet the PrEP target and we were quite far off. I want to acknowledge that there has been a huge number of people who have accessed PrEP in the last year. And according to AVAC's PrEP Watch website, we can see that there was over 2 million people who'd initiated PrEP by the end of the first quarter of this year. But the oral PrEP rollout has been less than ideal. And so we really need to look at more choices and more ways to accelerate access for people who would benefit the most. We also know that PrEP access hasn't been equitable within or between countries and populations. Here on this graph, you can see in purple the number of people who received PrEP at least once in 2020, and in red is the target. And you can see that there's varied uptake of PrEP by region. Also, when we look within a country, and here we can see data from the United States, that while 23% of those eligible for PrEP were accessing it, there were significant differences in coverage by race and ethnicity. And so obviously my point to you today is that we're going to need to differentiate PrEP service delivery as well. And we've seen this happen. So the differentiation of PrEP services has really been catalyzed by COVID-19. In recent years, we've seen longer PrEP refills, particularly for those in the PrEP continuation phase. We've seen PrEP refills being increasingly decentralized, including to home delivery through community groups and mobile services and complemented with virtual support. We've seen a shift towards demedicalization with more nurses providing and supporting PrEP and peers supporting PrEP as well. And we've also seen an expansion and a lot of innovation around what is offered as part of a person-centered PrEP delivery package. Current WHO guidance for PrEP includes oral PrEP, as well as obviously the vaginal ring, and there are additional prevention choices for those at substantial risk of HIV acquisition. In the guidance, WHO also does highlight the need for differentiated PrEP and that this may offer opportunities for efficiency, and also highlights the need for more operational research on the effectiveness and scalability of the trends towards these simplified, differentiated, and demedicalized oral PrEP that we have seen during COVID. So really what we want to do here is highlight that there are some analogous building blocks from treatment that we can look at for PrEP. So we need to look at PrEP refills separately from clinical consultations for PrEP and for different parts of PrEP. So here we are looking at PrEP assessment, initiation, and early follow-up, the first 3 months. And then we can look at different building blocks for PrEP continuation from 3 months onwards. So if you look at this PrEP continuation phase for those who are at substantial sustained risk of HIV acquisition, PrEP could be provided with longer refills at locations closer to home. And then we could look at different task sharing and ways of offering virtual support, whereas the clinical consultations could be less frequent during this maintenance phase. So just in summary then, COVID has really supported longer refills of oral PrEP. It's also led to HIV self-testing being used to support less frequent health visits during COVID-19. And this has led to reductions in in-person consultations, and we've seen great examples of the role of virtual support in enabling this. And we have also seen an increasing decentralization of PrEP refills through all the various kind of ways we've spoken about and through lay cadres and peers. We also see a ton of really exciting implementation science on differentiated PrEP. There's going to be some really great stuff at Montreal and virtually at AIDS 2022. And many of you who are speaking today are really key to this really exciting science that's coming out. And all of this really just highlights the potential role of longer PrEP refills, of less frequent clinical consultations, and supports task sharing in order to increase access to PrEP. So looking ahead, you'll know that WHO is working not just on guidance around CAB-LA, but also on a technical brief on differentiated PrEP for AIDS 2022. We are also working with a number of countries to update their guidance on PrEP, either when they update their clinical guidance or supporting them to include differentiated PrEP when they update their differentiated service delivery operational guidance. And we're really optimistic about the learnings from COVID-19 as they continue to be peer-reviewed and published. For PrEP, I just want to look really briefly at the building blocks in these service delivery considerations, and I'm glad that we're going to talk about this during the rest of the session today. So for long-acting in the when, it's obviously about reducing unnecessary visits to health facilities, and then also potentially about setting up fast-track options when it's just for a refill collection or for an injection. And then with the where, it's really about thinking about the location that different parts of the program can be done. So what needs to happen at a health facility versus community points. For the who, we want to think about how we can ensure that less clinical cadres can be involved and support different components of PrEP delivery. And then for the what, there's a lot of possibilities here. There's co-formulations, integration, and then obviously all the work around virtual and mHealth and telehealth interventions. I also think it's really important that we learn from family planning. There's really great examples of how they've demedicalized and delivered injectables and implantables in all sorts of settings and with task sharing as well. So just to close off, where to from here? Really briefly, what I want to say is that when we look at treatment and we look at PrEP, they're obviously different. And in the 2 hours today, and that's partially why it's 2 hours, we're wanting to do both. So for treatment, we've got a large number of people who are already established on daily oral treatments, but there are specific populations that could benefit from different formulations, absolutely. Treatment is also lifelong and it's already differentiated. And these things are all quite different from where we are with PrEP. With PrEP, there's smaller numbers and there's a number of people who would still benefit from access. PrEP need and risk changes over time. And while there's recognition of a shift to differentiated PrEP, it's still pretty new. And so we're still working on simplification, demedicalization, task sharing, et cetera. And also with PrEP, we really know that choice is important to increase uptake. And so that's also an area to focus on. So in summary, for long-acting HIV treatment, the question I have is it really about a new standard of care, given that we see most people are on 3 or 6 month refills with long spacing between clinical consultations? Or is it more about reaching specific groups, maybe those who are interrupting treatments, those who are not suppressed, or those with challenges? And can long-acting address and overcome some of these challenges? Could there be different first-line options depending on your choice of formulation? And then for PrEP, can we get to a place where we have a menu of informed choice options with different considerations? We know that options are important and that there are many who could benefit from PrEP who are currently not accessing prevention or PrEP. And we really need a differentiated approach to PrEP so that we can adapt the building blocks depending on the method or the product. So with long-acting, we have this common goal of trying to reach more people. And we must consider the current realities to make sure to take on the how, or these building blocks regarding implementation, and then think through how the long-acting formulations and platforms can overcome these current challenges with both treatment and prevention. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anna, for that really fantastic overview of differentiated service delivery and some of the challenges we face. And we're going to hear now a series of rapid fire perspectives from various stakeholders and what they believe to be the key service delivery considerations. in the development and implementation of these long-acting formulations and delivery platforms. And, you know, with some things in my mind about one global regimen first line and 3 to 6 monthly visits for DSD, I'm really pleased to ask Marco Vittoria, who's a medical officer in the Department of HIV and AIDS at the World Health Organization, to really tell us what policies and guidelines need to be put in place to ensure access to these long-acting therapies for the population who might benefit most. In the next 5 minutes, we're looking forward to hearing from you, Marco.
Thank you very much, Anton, for the opportunity. And also thanks for organizing this symposium to really help me to talk a little about this important topic. In this very rapid intervention, I'd like to just highlight some specific aspects that can make this discussion more live and more important in terms of opportunities and challenges that are facing with this new environment that has been discussed around the use of long-acting formulations for the treatment of HIV. And next slide, please. Well, the question that was put to me was what policies are needed to put in place in order to ensure access to long-acting therapy and what populations who may benefit from it. But in fact, I think the real question I'd like to start is what benefit to expect with transition to long-acting regimens. Consider that you have today a regimen that's TLD, that in fact is a regimen that has been covering 80% of the people living with HIV on treatment today, is a drug that has been well accepted, adopted by almost all low-income countries, drugs that have been used in different populations, and also with the adoption of a multi-month prescription that has been largely adopted in many countries. And basically, what we need from a long-acting, or even with the transition to long-acting that can beat TLD or the red that we have today. And basically, I just return back to what has been the ideal criteria in two aspects. One is about the drugs that you need. That basically is not different from what has been said for many times, even before TLD. That is about drugs that have high durability, high convenience, simple to use, low toxicity and tolerability, can be used across populations, and really have large availability at low price. This is already applicable since the times of D4T, 3TC, the European discussions long time ago, and trying to improve. It has been improved dramatically in the last years. But another component that's very important to discuss about self-delivery optimization. That can be an important topic when you talk about the use of long-acting antiretroviral drugs. Definitely, you need more longer time intervals between clinical disease and treatment refills. You need more service at primary care and really going towards community level, try to really maintain the patients at their entry level in order to really enhance the person-centered approach. Particular focus on psychosocial support and interventions that get more engagement and involvement of the peers. Definitely, that's important to discuss today, is about the level of infrastructure needs. Yeah, you need minimal program complexity, not only in terms of treatment initiation, but also in terms of the follow-up of patients, and also promote equity and integration with other health programs. And definitely the issue about cost-effective, cost savings should be considered as we're looking now for the trade-off between different regimens, in order to see what's the advantage to change a platform of millions and millions of people to a different thing. You need to really be clear that you are bringing benefits to the majority of them. Next slide, please. Then you have currently the cabotegravir reprieve as a kind of proof of concept for long-acting antiretrovirals. I say proof of concept because I think it's far from ideal yet to consider as the way to go with the drugs in this class. Then you have here the classic advantage and disadvantage. We clearly say that the drug has some interesting advantages. It's high viral suppression, low toxicity, good tolerability, can take every 1 to 2 months, can really be approved, particularly for those that are really adherent to treatment and suppress viral load. But usually they need a good infrastructure in order to maintain it. And there are several challenges with the current formulation that are using in some places. It's not approved for all populations. The drug is not active as important for infection that has been seen in the low-income countries. There is really a very important concern around the resistance in non-adherent patients, particularly to the PK tail. You also have safety and efficacy data in low-income countries, and clearly important challenge in terms of administration of the drugs, that is still intramuscular injections, 2 injections, large volumes, not self-administered yet. In some situations can require low oral lead-in dose. Delivery challenge because some drugs require cold chain. You need a private place for the injections and need really special healthcare worker training for that. And it's important, also I said before, the visit challenge, because you already moved the platform to 3 to 6 months in terms of the management of TLD, and with these current drugs is 1 to 2 months. That make this a little anachronic in terms of trying to promote. Next slide, please. Then I try to use the figure that I presented before, using the classic the building blocks on DSD, with the when, where, who, and what has been currently adopted with the DSD model, with the oral TLD. And then you can see what has been really the scenario with the current carbotegravir ribavirin. That is really the several drawbacks in terms of the way to go with these blocks. But in terms of the future long-acting injection that we're looking for, I think you can even go beyond what has been stated before with the TLD. We're expecting that the long-actings in the future, you can really looking for 6 to 12 months injection, self-injection with subcutaneous or implants, with visits around the same time around that is really very classic and adjusted with the monitoring systems. You really start to use non-traditional healthcare model like pharmacies, minute clinics, community-based, and mobile vans, other ways that is in the clinic, in the context of the community level. In terms of the who, clearly the prescription can be done in a more broad system, including clinics in primary care, also in communities, mobile, also in terms of the use of self-injection by patients. And very important to say about the what, because in fact, what you want is to really expand the current DSD models, including now the importance of the community support in order to really permit that the patient can stay in the system only in the situation they really need and maintain the control of this patient at the community level as much as possible. I think it's the time that I have now. Just remind people that really what is the critical goal that you have with the DSD, that is to decrease the barriers in access to care and guarantee the quality of services at reasonable cost in the healthcare system as a whole. And I like to an excellent note about my colleagues in WHO, Ajay, Clarice, Nathan, and Marco, that have some discussions about this before this talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Marco. And I think there's plenty to talk about during our discussion time from your presentation. It was really interesting. We've now got some more presentations and our pre-recorded perspectives from Kimberly Green, who leads PATH's Primary Healthcare Program, Nelson Otwoma, who's the Executive Director of NAFAC, and Peter Ehrenkrantz, the Deputy Director of HIV at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So over to you now.
Greetings, my name is Dr. Kimberly Green. I'm Global Primary Healthcare Director at PATH. And I've been asked to focus on 2 key questions related to long-acting HIV medicines. The first focuses on service delivery related barriers for adoption and implementation. And the second on what are the key unanswered questions related to service delivery of these new long-acting products. And so I'll be focusing specifically on service delivery considerations for long-acting injectables, devices such as implants and microarray patches, oral medications, as well as broadly neutralizing antibodies or BNABs. So if we look at the first question, there are 2 overarching points that are really important. The first is really understanding the challenge of being first. You know, it's fantastic that we now have long-acting products for treatment and prevention that are on market, but really also recognizing that with these products come all of the key challenges and questions that we need to work through on how best to ensure that long-acting products are affordable and available and accessible in lower middle income countries where they're most needed. The second is an issue related to demand. As we look at supply and demand, and this particularly speaks to PrEP. You know, with the start of PrEP, we really struggled with oral PrEP demand and uptake. And what we see now from studies looking at theoretical and also real world uptake of long-acting PrEP products is that, and also demand for long-acting treatment products is there's significant demand. And this includes in lower middle income countries and with a range of populations, including adolescent girls and young women, men, and key populations. So rather, really what we need to work through more are supply side or service delivery issues. And so there are a range of challenges to work through. Here I've highlighted really the top 10 that I think are important. And then really analyzing how those reflect across different types of long-acting products. So the first category are shorter duration long-acting injectables, such as those are on market right now, where every 2-month injection is required. But the second category focuses on longer duration long-acting injectables or devices like those that would be for, say, 6 months or longer. The third bucket focuses on the ring, which is available now in a number of countries, as well as long-acting oral products, which are in the pipeline. And then the fourth category is BNABs. So fundamentally across all 4 categories, but particularly for the first 3 and the last one, is this question related to cost and the importance of thinking through generics and having a strong generic manufacturing plan from the beginning, including partnerships with the medicine patent pool and others, really to make sure that there's differentiated or tiered pricing and that there is affordability for these products for low and middle income countries. Then the second key issue really focuses on whether there are more or less clinic visits with these products. How convenient are they to a client? And so really with the 2 injectable products for ART and for PrEP that are on market now, requiring an every 2-month return visit to the clinic. There are questions related to acceptability and preferences for clients with this increased requirement for 6 clinic visits a year. And then related to, in particular, the injectables and infusions, are additional provider training and regulatory approvals that may be required, as well as space for injection or transfusions in clinics, and supply chain and storage issues, particularly cold chain. All of these require then additional thinking around time and money for service delivery and potentially limit the differentiation of these models, limiting community delivery potentially. There are also some challenges that exist for some products for oral lead-in or managing the tail, and also specific population acceptability issues. One of those has to do with injection site, concerns among transgender women, and others really hoping for diversity of sites beyond buttock IM for the existing long-acting injectable products on market. For ART, also potential questions with inter-individual variability for pharmacokinetics. This is particularly a concern for those long-acting injectables, as well as managing adverse events or TB interactions. And lastly, the risk of increased resistance. So for implants or injectables, it's so important to ensure that there is that strong scheduling and support for returning to clinic, especially for ART. So now coming to the second question, what are those unanswered service delivery questions for long-acting PrEP and treatment? Fundamentally, there's been such tremendous work over the past decade plus to simplify, demedicalize, differentiate, and look at opportunities for integration for treatment and now for PrEP with fantastic models, including fast tracking, peer-led, mobile, pharmacy-based, home delivery, telemedicine, and more. These models really respond to client preferences and ultimately increase uptake and continuity in care. So the fundamental question for treatment is then how to integrate long-acting ART into these existing client-preferred service models, and how to address these additional requirements for training, certification, cold chain, potentially effective scheduling and follow-up, as well as tracking potential resistance. And for prevention, looking at how to build new products into existing service delivery platforms to optimize client choice and efficiencies or inform new models of care. So ultimately, the end goal is really that implementation science needs to identify ways to seamlessly integrate long-acting medicines into existing client-preferred platforms or to rapidly launch new models of care. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. My name is Nelson Otuoma. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. I work with the National Network of People Living with HIV, which is a national recipients of care network, and which has been working with the Ministry of Health to make sure that people living with HIV and recipients of care receive and utilize services to prevent, treat, and manage HIV. On the subject of preferences for recipients of care, I think the news of long-acting injectables have been received with excitement among people living with HIV and all recipients of care. However, that excitement needs to be met with the capacity building so people understand exactly what we mean long-acting. Is it something that can be done through injections, the mild ones like COVID, or does it require regular bigger injections? Who is to administer it? Can recipients of care be educated and trained to administer this at home, or must they go to a health facility? And for how long, and so on and so forth. Since in Kenya, we have over 1 million people who will be looking for HIV treatment, it is a preference of recipients of care that we adopt strategies that don't let people crowd in facilities and don't take a lot of time in facilities. So we, in the midst of differentiated service delivery that Kenya is currently working on, we would prefer a situation where this is done in dispensaries, pharmacies that are decentralized, not in the high-level hospitals where there are many people. The essence of having people go to dispensaries and pharmacies is to ensure that there is no crowding and that people can go to places near them or places that they prefer rather than walking to hospitals that are known. We also need to remember that in as much as we are coming up with the long-acting injectables, HIV is still largely stigmatized in certain quarters and in certain populations criminalized. So people would prefer their consent, privacy, and confidentiality maintained and guaranteed. So we would want this to go into the level of where people can go to pharmacies or community pharmacies like we do in with the ART, so that they get their injections. But in future, when technology allow and when tools allow, I think people would prefer to have certain recipients of care would prefer to have the injections and the medicines that they can carry home and then they administer in the safety of their homes. For a start, because we know that is not possible, we would be happy for this to be staged in a facility where people pick their treatment, but in a manner that don't take long hours and long queues and fit well within the differentiated service delivery. We also know that as we talk about the pills, we have been talking about multi-month dispensing. I'm not sure whether the injectables would allow that, but that is one advantage that people want to see in the treatment going forward, that people are able to not just visit a facility if need does not arise, but to only go if there is need. So if this is 2 weekly or 2 monthly, then I think people would be preferring situations where they can stage this in at a center that is useful to them. I also know communities and recipients of care are organizing into groups, and it would be good to also explore whether this can be brought to groups in a particular day that people have agreed appointment. The same way these days they collect medicine through their leader. But if the healthcare worker can come to those support groups or community ART groups and administer the injection for those who volunteer to that, that would be something that is preferred. The last point I want to emphasize is that HIV comes with a conversation. It is not just an injectable. So we would still prefer healthcare workers who can have a discussion and talk with the people who are receiving this medication, so that the issues of viral loads, adherence, and being undetectable is not left to the lab, but the healthcare worker administering this injection can also have a conversation and ask from the recipients of care, apart from this injection, what else would you prefer today so that you sustain your good health and quality of health? Lastly, I also want to emphasize that We know in Kenya we've had problems with stocks of medicines, and we hope that when injectables eventually reach in this country, we would not have stockouts of injection, because that will come with a lot of anxiety and fear and so on and so forth. But the point I'm emphasizing is that this should also adhere to the preference of recipients of care, whether people want to take this at home, at a facility, as a hospital, or a community group, or at pharmacy level. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to respond to any specific question if there is.
Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. This is Peter Ehrenkrantz calling in from Seattle. Some of you may know the well-known management aphorism, culture eats strategy for breakfast. I'd like to propose a corollary. Service delivery eats new innovations for lunch. A new technology or innovation has to meet the needs of a number of stakeholders to be successfully launched into the world and delivered to those whom it is hoped will most benefit. In other settings, we might emphasize the perspectives of the funder, the originator company, or the generic manufacturer. My colleagues have discussed the role of supportive WHO guidance and national policies, and I want to continue to emphasize some of those themes they addressed regarding the most impactful step in the process of introducing an innovation, the means of delivering the service in a manner that is acceptable, feasible, of reasonable cost, and with potential for scale and sustainability. All of these outcomes need to be considered from the perspective of the healthcare system, the healthcare worker, and especially the client. For treatment, we already have a daily oral pill that meets most of these needs. Tenofovir, lamivudine, dolutegravir, or TLD, is a well-tolerated once-daily medicine that costs less than $60 per person per year and can be given to clients in bottles that contain up to 6 months of supply. These pill bottles can be handed out in any setting, facility, or community, with or without the presence of a trained healthcare worker. Oral TLD is now used by almost 90% of adults in low and middle income countries, more than 20 million people, and more than 80% of these are successfully virally suppressed. Through differentiated service delivery models that decrease the required frequency of health system interactions and move the service closer to the patient, many programs are drastically decreasing the time, energy, and money required for a client to access TLD. Simultaneously, they are decreasing the resources required for the health system to deliver the medicine, theoretically freeing up healthcare worker time to be used for the clients who need the care most, those who are ill and those with serious psychosocial challenges. Because TLD has so many positive attributes and is already delivered in an increasingly patient and health system friendly manner, any new innovation has a high threshold to cross. Still, it is important to ask, could a long-acting antiretroviral help the 20% of people who are not virally suppressed on TLD? Perhaps, but we must realize that the people who remain unsuppressed are the individuals with the greatest adherence challenges: adolescent boys and young men, migrant workers, and people living in conflict settings. These are folks with psychosocial or structural challenges that prevent them from staying in care or adherent to treatment. To reach these people, not to mention those who are already suppressed but might also prefer a longer acting medicine, an ideal treatment product would have to require very little from the health system, and, given the known challenges faced by the priority patient populations, expect even less of the client. This ideal product should not cost too much more than oral TLD. It should not require maintenance within a cold chain. It should be formulated or co-packed into a single dose product and have a means of administration that is very acceptable to clients. Ideally, it would be self-administered, oral or subcutaneous, or a patch, or if it has to be a small volume injection, or if it has to be an injectable, it should be as small volume as possible. Obviously, we want it to be as long acting as possible as well, at least 3 monthly, so it can be coordinated with other products like injectable contraceptives. It should have very rare adverse events or risk of resistance if the client is not adherent. All of these factors will influence the process of service delivery and determine the acceptability, feasibility, costs, and potential for scale of the product. All stakeholders, funders, healthcare workers, and clients will be very quick to compare any new treatment product with the known benefits and flexibility of delivering and taking oral TLD. For HIV prevention, on the other hand, the service delivery bar is lower. There is no equivalent to TLD in large-scale use throughout high-risk populations. We must still keep the same service delivery considerations in mind, however. Acceptability, feasibility, cost, and potential for scale all can help us imagine the ideal product. It should require minimal central laboratory testing to determine client eligibility for initiation and refill. And as with treatment, the dosing of a prevention product should be infrequent and aligned with other long-acting products like injectable contraceptives. As potential PrEP users may not otherwise have a pattern of visiting healthcare workers regularly, a self-administered product such as a subcutaneous injectable, a patch, a long-acting pill, or a ring might be particularly well received. If the product is to be an injectable, as with treatment, it should be of small volume and be available in settings where the clients who are most in need, such as adolescent girls and young women, men who have sex with men, and sex workers can easily access it. In other words, outside of health facilities and requiring minimal engagement with trained healthcare workers. Despite all of these substantial challenges, my colleagues and I at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation remain very excited about advances in the field of long-acting formulations of antiretrovirals, both for treatment and prevention. And we look forward to working with all stakeholders to ensure that the technologies that are eventually introduced will succeed at this last step of service delivery and be available to all who need them most. Thank you.
Thank you. I think some thought-provoking presentations and insights there. Next, I'd like to introduce Nataya Panupak. I hope I pronounced that correctly, Nataya, who is Executive Director at the Institute of HIV Research and Innovation in Bangkok, Thailand, and is also the IAS Governing Council representative. Nataya is going to walk us through some of the enablers and implementation challenges that we really need to consider around long-acting prevention technologies. Nataya.
Thank you very much. My name is Nitaya Panupak, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of HIV Research and Innovation, or IHRI, which is based in Bangkok, Thailand. It is my great honor and my great pleasure to share some thoughts around the enablers and challenges in the planning of the implementation of long-acting prevention or PrEP products with all of you today. We have heard a lot from the panelists in the previous session, and my role here will be to answer these two key questions. Why is service delivery model such an important aspect when thinking about implementing long-acting PrEP? And what are key considerations from a service delivery perspective? What are enablers and what are challenges? I will use a few slides to show you why service delivery model is such an important aspect when considering how to integrate long-acting PrEP into existing PrEP program in each country. These data are based on Thailand experience and will only be used to frame the discussion on this issue. Here, what you can see on this slide is that among countries in Southeast Asia, PrEP scale-up has been varied. Thailand and Vietnam have had the highest number of cumulative PrEP users of more than 30,000 individuals by the first quarter of this calendar year. This was followed by the Philippines at 3,000 and Myanmar at almost 2,000. These countries share similarity in oral PrEP scale-up program, as the main service delivery model successfully implemented is currently through a community-led, or to be more specific, key population-led service delivery model. In Thailand, more than 80% of current PrEP users receive PrEP from key population-led providers in key population-led clinics, which are currently located in strategic provinces and are expanding in number. And although Thailand is second only after Australia, as a country with the largest number of PrEP users in Asia Pacific, we were only successful in getting just above 1/5 of people who would benefit from PrEP to be aware of and make decision to start oral PrEP, although with continuous efforts being made over almost 8 years after PrEP was first recommended in our national guidelines in 2014. And therefore, more efforts and innovations are certainly needed. Now, I'd like to give you a tangible example of how the key population-led PrEP service delivery model works in Thailand. Here, once an individual comes into a key population-led clinics, which is run by KP-led providers without the presence of doctors or nurses, that individual will receive blood draw and HIV testing using the 4th generation rapid test. The negative HIV test results will then be shared with a doctor via an online chat application. The doctor will review and approve PrEP prescription back via that application. And the first bottle of PrEP or many bottles of PrEP refill will be given to the client almost within the same hour of the client coming in for HIV testing. And this flow is used both for PrEP initiation and PrEP follow-up. The key population-led PrEP service has been very successful in scaling up oral PrEP program because it provides the client with accessibility, with availability of client center service, which is not just PrEP, but it includes services such as gender affirming service for trans people or legal consultation service for sex workers. It also provides acceptability of services as providers are members of key population communities from the same communities as the client, and services are free from judgmental attitudes and discrimination. And lastly, it is of high quality. It is trusted by, and it has close linkage to the public healthcare system. The success of KP-led service is in scale-up PrEP was one factor which facilitated the legalization of KP-led providers' roles in 2019 by our Ministry of Public Health. KP-led providers can perform clinical services, which include blood sample collection and other STI sample collection. They can run point-of-care testing for HIV and other STIs and report these test results to their clients. They can also give out oral drugs as prescribed virtually or remotely by doctors, and these include PrEP, PEP, ART, and oral STI treatment. Now, the KP-led PrEP service is operated using the three principles shown here. The first one is the demedicalization, which is to identify the elements of PrEP service which can be shifted or can be shared with KP-led providers or with the clients themselves. And the next principle is the simplification, which is to find less complex ways to deliver service while maintaining efficacy and quality. And the last principle is the differentiation, which is to think about the who, the when, the where, and the what building blocks using a client-centered approach. To think about integrating CAP into KP-led PrEP service as an example to start a discussion around the implementation of long-acting PrEP products, we can see that CAP-LA will bring us towards re-medicalization, not demedicalization, as product administration role will be task shifted back from KP-led providers to nurses, to doctors, and we still don't know if thigh injection or reduced volume injection or reduced visit injection or subcutaneous injection will be made possible, as this can lead to CAP-LA being made possible for self-injection. And instead of simplification, CAP-LA comes with more complexity, as HIV testing algorithm will need HIV RNA assay, and we still don't know if third or fourth generation rapid test or third or fourth generation self-testing or pooled HIV RNA can be used. And lastly, there are challenges with various user patterns now that we have more PrEP products, and we still don't know how to handle more frequent CAP-LA visits, or how to handle switching in between the oral and CAP-LA products. And if this happens, who can handle it, or where should this be handled, and how can this be handled? So based on those three principles, we can see that they relate to the enablers to be considered when thinking about CAP-LA implementation, which are convenience and compatibility of services and competence in product administration. For convenience and compatibility, we need to continue thinking about simplification and differentiation, continue to explore how CAP-LA can be brought out from public hospital or public clinic to community-led or KP-led or even at home. In addition, for competence in product administration, as CAP-LA in its current form needs to be injected into gluteal muscle by conventional healthcare providers, we will need to think about a formal demedicalization by shifting the injection role from doctors and nurses to lay providers or to the clients themselves. There are several challenges to balance the complex nature of CAP-LA implementation while maintaining these enablers. And to be able to deliver CAP-LA not only in public hospitals and clinic, but also in community-led or KP-led clinic or at home, we may need to differentiate the who, when, where, and what for CAP-LA initiation capital A, continuation, discontinuation with concern about the tail, with its reinitiation, and with switching in between oral and injectable products. We also need to differentiate HIV testing algorithm according to PrEP status just mentioned here to understand when NAT is needed, or when the third or fourth generation rapid test can be used, or when can the third or fourth generation HIV self-testing be used. We also want to simplify CAP-LA service through integration with family planning, with gender affirming, and with STI and HCV test and treat services. And we still don't know how to best provide adherence support for a clinic visit, which now becomes very important as the clinic visit equals the product administration. And to ensure product administration competency without the need for re-medicalization. There's a lack of clinical research data on self-injection, on reduced volume injection or reduced visit or alternative injection sites such as to thigh muscle or for subcutaneous injection, and therefore difficulties in planning implementation research. And we still don't know how to build capacity and provide quality assurance for injection by lay providers or for self-injection. And we can also foresee resistance from professional institutions due to regulations, due to rules, and most importantly, due to their mindset. Now, to think of other long-acting PrEP products beyond CAP-LA, we can see common implementation considerations and how each of them score in certain aspects. Comparing oral PrEP and CAP-LA, although it looks like CAP-LA scores better in terms of the frequency of product use, but since we haven't had experience in integrating injectable product in a PrEP clinic before, and we still don't know who can be the injector, we also don't know how to support adherence to clinic visit, which will now happen every 2 months, and whether we have money to test for HIV and STI more frequently with more sophisticated assays, and with almost no possibility to have generic product available in the near future. We may have to admit that we don't see much opportunity for scale up. We hope that other long-acting PrEP products in the pipeline will consider these implementation challenges when designing clinical trials. Kind of start with the end in mind, please, and therefore we should be able to move forward more quickly from clinical trials to implementation research and to the actual implementation for our future products. I'd like to end with a few thoughts. We have discussed a lot about implementation challenges. However, the other key challenge is the availability of the product. Long-acting PrEP will be unlikely to become true choice without generic products, not even in high-income countries. We have heard about market sizing and price, which is a chicken or egg paradox, and it is not very healthy to hear this being mentioned repeatedly in a negotiating sense. And creating demand for true choice is crucial. Long-acting product and its users can be stigmatized, especially if CAP-LA is positioned as a second-line PrEP. Oral PrEP users is already stigmatized, as PrEP is related to sex, is related to sexual pleasure, which are very much devalued in my region. And individual or wanting to use injectable PrEP can be further stigmatized, as they can be seen as being irresponsible in sex and now irresponsible even in just taking pills. And the research studies on self-injection, reduced volume, reduced visit, alternative injection sites are all urgent in order to plan implementation. But these studies have not been openly discussed in any form. And implementers will need to know what options will become available and when, in order to be able to plan or to adapt their implementation research in real time, and also to prepare many other things in the countries like service delivery system, guidelines, payment mechanism, and regulations and policy beforehand. And lastly, I want to say that I'm still very optimistic. And therefore, I want to say that things may seem not feasible until we do it. It is just this time. We just want to do it with a better plan than what we have had before for oral PrEP implementation. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Natalia. Now we're going to go into our panel discussion and hopefully drive a bit deeper with our panelists in terms of what's really required to enable new technologies to be utilized and accessible through the current service delivery systems. So I'm going to invite Nataya, Maureen, Sinead, Kenneth and Helen, the other Helen B, to please turn on your cameras and unmute yourselves so we can start the discussion. Just briefly, whilst our panelists do that, I'll just give you a quick introduction to each of our panelists today, and I'm sure you'll agree we've got a great range of experts to stimulate the discussion further today, so please also do put your questions in the chat as well. So firstly, we've got Maureen Marenga, who's the Executive Director of the Lean On Me Foundation, and she's also part of the Global Fund Advocates Network. She's a passionate advocate for the health, development and human rights of women and girls. Sinead Delaney-Marotwe is a clinical epidemiologist and Professor and Director of Research at WITS RHI. She's a South African-born medical doctor, and her experience is primarily in sexual and reproductive health and HIV prevention research. Then we've got Kenneth Nguyen, who is an Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of the Community Health at the Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology in Kenya. He's also an Affiliate Associate Professor of the University of Washington and an IAS Governing Council representative. He's a recognized scientist in the fields of behavioral research, family planning, and HIV prevention. And then finally, Helen Bygrave, who is a medical doctor who's worked for many years in HIV and TB programming in Africa and Asia. Currently, she's working as the IAS Differentiated Service Delivery Consultant and is also a HIV TB advisor at MSF. So welcome and thank you for joining us today for this panel discussion. I'm sure lots of food for thought from all of the presentations and inputs so far, but perhaps I can start by posing a question to you to really ask you to think from your perspective, what do you see as the most critical service delivery considerations that need to be factored into the development of long-acting formulations, both in terms of the technology and the delivery? I don't know who would like to start the discussion. Maureen, I can see you've come off mute. So Maureen, perhaps you'd like to share some thoughts first.
Thank you very much. And this has been such a rich discussion with very detailed thoughts from the past speakers. And I can say when we first heard about the long-acting commodities, we were quite excited. But then again, it comes to what kind of, how would they be administered? What is the state of our health facilities? Are they equipped enough to administer or to shift us to these new products? As we have seen, it's always been a challenge in terms of shifting or transitioning from the current products because of issues around supply chain and past procurements that could still be in the country. But again, we also want to consider some of the things that Nelson mentioned and other speakers around it being a person-centered commodity, that one that works well. For example, if I stay 6 months away from the facility and a commodity comes that I have to take every 2 weeks, then I don't think it would be really pleasant for me who has to go to work and do other things. So I think that is one of the consideration. Another one is around, we've seen good products come and sometimes they don't fit into the, I mean, our facilities are not equipped enough to handle them. For example, when we had the pediatric formulation that was heat sensitive and therefore needed refrigeration, not all health facilities are. So these products need to consider that as well. We also need to consider the skills and the expertise of the staff, how easy it will be to train them. So the user friendly, the friendlier it is to the user, the better it is. If it is difficult to administer, if it is difficult to mix doses and stuff like that, then it becomes again another challenge. Another one would be around what we call pharmacovigilance. If maybe I have a 3 months injection
and I developed side effects, I mean, it would take 3 months to address the side effects because the drug will be in my body. So it really has to be really well tested, and it should be something better than DTG, I should say, because many people have said here that the combination of dolutegravir, lamivudine, and the TLD has set the bar so high, so that any commodity that comes should be what is better than what is currently the best. So I think it's both about our health systems being able to administer this in a way that is still friendly, it's still confidential, and that it's feasible to do. Another one is that we don't want a product that would leave other populations behind, especially pediatrics. If we are getting long-lasting PrEP, we should also get long-lasting prophylaxis, because it's not feasible for a mother to, I mean, it doesn't make sense if I have a long-lasting commodity that makes me stay out of the facility, but I have to take my child for prophylaxis every so often. So I think this should be across the populations that we are getting long-lasting commodities, including the prophylaxis for the children. So I think what for me would really suit the thing is that we need to consider that our countries have different health systems. And so I think the weakest health system makes our strongest link or our strongest case. So when considering these products, we should consider the weakest health system. Thank you.
Thanks, Maureen. Some really lots of points there about frequency, location, the convenience, as well as the sort of reflection on the healthcare system and infrastructure, and thinking about the complexity and the uniqueness of every single one, which of course is a challenge to balance that whilst you know, from a global development perspective, but absolutely critical when it comes to the service delivery, as you say. I don't know if another of our panelists would like to add a comment.
Sure.
Helen? Perfect.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. And I say, really interesting hearing all the other presentations, and I think we're all actually, you know, really coming with a similar perspective, which is great. I'm going to kind of have 3 kind of key considerations I want to flag, really kind of coming back to the framing of the elements and the building blocks. And I think the element, the key element here is kind of around the specific population. What percentage of our cohort are we really thinking about offering long-acting formulations to? Are we going to be selecting populations based maybe on those who have less good rates of viral suppression, maybe pregnant breastfeeding women, is there an argument that they might want to move to long-acting during that period? So this kind of selection of populations that may or may not be doing so well on our very effective current first line, versus integrating long-acting into a menu of possible you know, options that we offer to somebody starting ART. And I think that is a really key question, because that's a really key question in terms of numbers of clients who are going to be put onto long-acting formulations, and what that price point would be for a long-acting formulation, to be able to actually put it into a menu for all versus very selective populations. So I think that population element is really key in our considerations. The other really big one, we've all been saying it, the when. Can we be visit neutral is what I would say. Can we be visit neutral in against what we're currently doing? And to say many countries, we're now working at IS with many countries on their new service delivery operational guidance at national level. We see some countries already having an annual visit. So how do we kind of not, as Anna said, re-burden our health systems and re-burden our clients? You know, Maureen said it. I think really having that conversation around the balance of taking a daily oral pill, but coming once a year, versus having to unless we enable out of facility injections, having to come to a facility, pay the transport for that. And then lastly, and I think Natalia touched on it, is around the task sharing. And at the minute we know the challenges of policy around enabling lower cadres, so community health workers, to inject. We face this with community delivery of family planning. We've done a lot of MDR work, DRTB work, where we actually did train community health workers to give IM injections. So, but we are faced in those situations with a lot of policy blockers from many countries. And I think unless we work to overcome those policy blockers to enable task sharing, which enables it by kind of follow-on decentralization, we will not move this forward. And I just want to pick up on the word several people have used, is demedicalize, when we talk about PrEP, because unless we have our health systems and policymakers happy to push PrEP out into the community, to be seen less often at the facility, I think whether we have long acting or not, I don't think we're going to kind of move far forward. So population, visit neutral, policies for task sharing, which will enable decentralization, would be my key considerations, Helen. Thanks.
Thanks, Helen. Really, really good points there to build. I don't know, Kenneth or Sinead, whether you'd like to add to your perspectives on the considerations.
Yes, I'm happy to add, and great presentations. I think we've had a lot of insights, and part of them will sound like I'm repeating some of the things said, but I try to stick to some of the points that I had. And one of them, being a behavioral scientist, is thinking about the end user. Who is the end user? Are we able to include the end user perspectives in the design of delivery, of service delivery, so that as we are designing the service delivery, we go get end user input, so that for that adolescent girl in Kenya or in South Africa, how would they want services delivered to them, so that they can uptake and have optimum continuation. That would be very important. And as we think about that end user, we may also want to include their preferences on what kind of services they would want for startup, which may differ for continuation, so that then we end up then having high continuation. Then we may also want to think about the provider and the country regulations. As we think about long-acting products, some countries have strict regulations on, for example, who can give injectables. And that probably requires a lot of advocacy to sort of move from the clinician to others. I know countries are now starting to soften that, with some of the countries having pharmacists giving injectables, and that would be a platform, giving injectable contraception. So if they're giving injectable contraceptive, we could also leverage on some of these other cadres in giving now long-acting injectable prevention or treatment products. We also want to get provider input when we are thinking about service delivery, so that the services are responsive not only to end user needs, but also to providers, and they are able to, respond to have their own input. And closely related to that, one of the key gaps that we find is the issue of training. Providers need capacity build. We have been having oral PrEP, for example, in Kenya for close to 5 years or more, but there are still gaps in knowledge when it comes to oral PrEP. So we need to think about training providers on long-acting treatment and prevention products. And I'm happy we're having this discussion now. This is a very timely discussion, because I think it opens avenues for us to think about how do we start engaging providers even before the products come, so that they get to know, to have their knowledge on this. And how do we not only train them? What another gap we have found is that we do not only train providers, they require support, so that in the few months after they start providing products, they have a place where they can ask questions, they can have refresher courses. If they are transferred and we have new providers, there is a way of training. And I think COVID has shown us that we can be innovative when it comes to provider training. And then community providers would be also, we could look into that for some of the products. again, working very closely with national governments to think about the regulations that exist for some of the products. Then another consideration is within where to deliver these services. Within health facilities, it's not one size fits all. We have learned from oral prep. When we started delivering oral prep in Kenya, we were delivering oral prep in HIV clinics. Well, we found that this was acceptable to especially those in HIV serodiscordant couples. For some, especially adolescent girls and young women, these points of delivery were not very acceptable. So we need to think about moving away from one place to deliver a product to multiple places so that we can cater for different end user needs. And this could include MCH, FP. It could include what we are currently doing. We are starting to pilot in Kenya, PrEP in pharmacies. And this has been informed by what we've learned in oral PrEP, that there are people, or a significant population, especially in Kenya, close to 50% of people who get their regular care in pharmacies. So would this then be another avenue to deliver long-acting treatment and prevention products so that we can maintain high uptake and continuation? And so not to take so much time, is that as we think about these things, let us know that it's, even for long-acting products, it's not one size fit all. It's the different products will require different service points and to cater for needs for different people and preferences, and that as we do this, we will not drop the current products. Like in Kenya and other countries, we have oral PrEP. We are also having the ring coming on place. So these products need to be delivered together, as we have learned from the field of contraception. So I'll pause there. Thank you.
Thanks, Kenneth. And Sinead, any additional comments from yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone has made fantastic points and it's been a great discussion. I think building on what Kenneth talked about, I think it's helpful to think of the user and what the user wants. And I think we know that people want agents that are going to be discreet, that are not necessarily always going to out them for kind of taking medications either for treatment or prevention. And they want something that they can get and forget so that they don't have to be reminded every day that they are ill or kind of avoiding HIV. And so long-acting agents, I think, sort of provide a great opportunity. And although these agents may not be perfect, I think we have at least two prototypes. We have for prevention, we have a ring as well, but we have injectables, and they're going to teach us a lot. What I think we have to think about when we're thinking about designing long-acting agents is who's going to use these agents. And for me, working in sub-Saharan Africa, I think what's been really important is to think about ensuring that we have data on use in people of childbearing potential, so pregnant and breastfeeding women, but also that people who do not want to become pregnant, they can use these drugs safely with contraceptives. And Natia also talked about gender-affirming hormones. So I think thinking about who's going to use the product. The other group that uses PrEP, for example, but also antiretrovirals are adolescents. So do we have data that supports the use in these populations so they don't get left behind? And then another thing I think it's important to think about are what are the other comorbidities or other drugs that we're going to use that often have drug interactions. So for example, in our region, TB drugs are important, and thinking about how new products are going to sort of interact with TB, or at least having the data. Then I think sort of on the health system side of things, the biggest thing for me would be cost. There's no point designing these products if they can't be used in the places where they need it most. And we understand, kind of that there is work to be done to kind of address issues of sort of access and voluntary licensing. But I do think that sort of needs to be an important conversation, because many ministries may not adopt technologies if they're unaffordable. People have raised the question about who administers long-acting agents, and I think, kind of that's really sort of where implementation science is going to help us. But I also think, kind of as we think about who's going to administer, as a number of people have mentioned, we need to consider the context in which, certainly in prevention, these products are being offered, where they're being offered as a choice. and what do we need to support choice decisions where clients' values and preferences are actually aligned with products. And people use contraception as a corollary, but I would argue that contraception is different. Most contraceptive products have very high efficacy, but in HIV prevention, we have products that have had different efficacy readouts, different safety profiles, different reversibility profiles, and it's quite a complicated conversation to have. And then I think the sort of next thing that we need to think about when supporting providers is how do we start to train people in messaging, not just about starting, but also stopping and switching, and sort of what that means in terms of use. And then I think the last thing that hasn't been talked a lot, but mentioned, is really sort of what does this mean for our HIV testing approaches? I think we've become sort of very comfortable with sort of very sort of point of care testing approaches. It's been mentioned that we might need, kind of different testing approaches, and how do we not make it too complicated so that it becomes a barrier to use, but also kind of recognize that there may be trade-offs and be able to kind of talk with communities and providers and clients about what those trade-offs are, and kind of be able to move forward. And then also sort of just in terms of the agents, while we may not be able to co-formulate them currently, can we co-administer, and can we think about what that means really for sort of integrated service delivery so that services are efficient. So I agree that, kind of there are a number of challenges with sort of the first generation products, but I do think there are still opportunities to demedicalize and decentralize. And I think putting end users kind of at the center of that, but also recognizing health systems capacities, particularly in low and middle income countries, is going to be really important for the development, not just of these products, but new products.
Thanks, Shanor. That's a great other challenges that we have. One big question that I'd like not only to ask the panel, but perhaps people, especially from the pharma industry online, is that we have got this DSD service now in various models, which has been pretty successful, as we've seen from the presentations, which can move into PrEP. We've also got a single, basically recommended first-line therapy, and there's been a lot of work built around that therapy in order that it can be administered, given out, and people get refills, etc., etc. What is the next step, though, for these long actings? I mean, we can discuss a lot of the challenges and a lot of the things we want to do, but should we now start large-scale implementation projects so that we can iron out some of the things that we've been talking about today? And how would that, who would do that, and how would it go about? There may be things already going on, we've seen clinical trials, etc., but it would really be quite interesting to know from you guys what you think we should be doing as the next quick step, because it's not just about injectables. They're the vanguard. We're going to have a whole load of other things coming through in the next 5 to 10 years. And I think we should be ready today with big implementation projects. Now I'm to give you my opinion, so that we can move new things in. So I don't know what you think about that as a question.
Are you addressing that to the panel, Anton?
Yeah, to the panel and to anyone who wants to raise their hand. Unfortunately, I'm having to do this on my phone, so I can't really see raised hands very easily. So I might ask Helen to do that. But yeah, please, anyone to just respond.
Well, I'll start. I do think defining an implementation science agenda and a set of questions that will allow us to begin to answer the many questions that people have raised is going to be critical. And I know, at least in terms of the rollout of long-acting PrEP agents, so cabotegravir and the dapivirine vaginal ring, there are a number of implementation science projects that are planned in the African region. I think sort of what's been identified is that we need to go beyond into other regions. So there are some plans for Latin America. I kind of Natia can talk about what's needed in Asia, but we definitely need to move from the trials to implementation, but build confidence in the health system, which has a number of questions like, do we need an oral lead-in? Do we need to cover the tail? How do we test? What support do we need for healthcare providers? I think these implementation science projects are going to be critical to answering those questions.
Yeah, and we don't want to be hanging around for too many years, as we sort of did in some parts of the world with PrEP. You know, we have to get more and more and more answers until we saw that it was very useful.
Anton, I can see Beatrice has got her hand up. So Beatrice, I don't know if you want to comment.
Yes, thank you very much. So I think that the presentations were really great in covering several points that are important, and the panel discussion was really fantastic. Regarding the implementation projects, someone put in the chat that the Mosaic study is funded by PEPFAR and will include several sites in sub-Saharan Africa. And we have been funded through UNITAID to do implementation study. We had the IMPREP study that covered 3 countries in Latin America, Peru, Mexico, and Brazil. With oral PrEP, we enrolled almost 10,000 individuals, and results were presented at CROI this year. And after that study, we moved into the development of an implementation study for CAB-LA, but unfortunately, this will be only done in Brazil. We were not allowed. There was no interest, I believe, by ViiV, that is donating the drug, for us to have this project implemented in the 2 other countries, what is something that is really a missed opportunity given the entire infrastructure we had in place. But anyway, we are moving forward with this implementation study for CAB-LA for PrEP that will enroll 1,200 young MSM and trans individuals. And we are in the submission phase to the WHO ERC and to ViiV, and the expectation is that we initiate this study by September, October this year. But given even it's designed as an implementation study, we are having several iterations with ViiV in regards to the requirements that they are putting in these projects as well. So we still have issues related to hepatitis B and C co-infection that it was not touched in this conversation, but these are also important points. Also in the context of choice, if someone is using TDF-FTC PrEP and wants to move to cabotegravir, this has been a large discussion with the folks as well. And also individuals who are found to have a hepatitis C, the recommendation is also not to include them if they need, of course, they will need to start hepatitis C treatment. So there are areas that need a lot of discussion, and unfortunately, maybe even with the implementation studies moving forward, we may not have the opportunity to answer several questions. These are just a couple of examples. There is also another study that is funded by UNITAID in South Africa that is from Sinead's group, and she can comment on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Beatrice. I can see a few more hands up. Carissa from ViiV, I don't know if you want to speak next, given some of the questions and commentary from Beatrice, and then we've got Jessica from AVAC, and then back to Kenneth.
Great, thanks very much, Helen, and hi everyone. Really nice to be here and very interesting discussion. So just to add to the conversation and to just emphasize and kind of address the question that Anton posed, we fully support the implementation science agenda, and we understand the need to collect data and understand how to fill gaps related to implementation before large countries and international donors will support rollout. And we want to make sure that the way these are conducted inform guidelines and policies, and that they, really addressed a lot of the issues that were raised today in terms of effective service delivery models. How do we tackle adherence and persistence? What about task shifting? And really importantly, around demand creation and particularly destigmatization. So we recently presented our strategy for implementation science at a biopic meeting that happened, I think, in late April, which was convened by AVAC and WHO, which laid out our comprehensive approach to the evidence gaps that we're hoping to fill, and then also kind of outlined some of the studies that we are undertaking very shortly that will be in the US, and also some of the collaborations that we're starting to discuss that Beatrice mentioned with Unitaid, and then others with Mosaic, I see in the chat, and with other groups. So we have a dedicated team that addresses implementation science that is very open to proposals and collaborations. I think it's important for us to note that where we are starting to look at studies is in areas in countries where we have regulatory submissions, and so we do have to be conscious of that. But I hope that the folks who had joined the biopic call would agree that the evidence gaps and where we're focusing are quite aligned with the overall evidence gaps that have been put forth by WHO and others. And I apologize, I'm speaking quietly. I'm in an open plan office, but I'll pause there and turn back over to Helen and the rest. Thank you.
Thanks, Carissa. I think Jessica from the AVAC team had a hand up as well. Jessica.
Yes, thank you. And it picks up where Carissa left off, and just wanted to mention that under the biomedical biomedical prevention implementation and collaborative biopic, we held a recent meeting with mostly with implementers, as well as VIV, as Carissa mentioned, and we're tracking implementation studies. There are about 17 in total that are planned. Some are funded, some are not. And the intention is really to learn from the oral prep experience, where there were very small scale demonstration projects, to really convene the group of implementers that are taking these implementation studies forward in order to share design plans from very early stages, as well as hopefully data sharing and lessons learned as these implementation studies are conducted, really to share the lessons early on. And I think, as Carissa mentioned, just to reiterate what she said, there seems to be wide coverage in terms of diversity of populations, diversity of regions and countries that are implementing these studies. And we also have a implementation science agenda that was developed again with partners in late December. So happy to share that with all of you as well. Thank you. Over.
Thanks, Jessica, for that. And before we go to Kenneth and back to Africa, can I just ask Natalia about this question? What she's aware of happening now? Because you've done so much implementation research on PrEP. What's happening with long-acting and projects in Asia? Natalia, or your thoughts on that?
Thank you very much, Anton. I mean, we yesterday just had a community forum to discuss CAP-LA in Thailand, and I think we probably is the first country in the region start to discuss this at a national level. And I feel that yes, because there are two countries in Asia, Vietnam and Thailand, which participated in the HPTN-083 study. We feel that, and we are the two countries where PrEP scale up most advanced in the region, and that the stakeholders in the countries are all very excited, knowing that CAP-LA will be coming. But the challenges is we know that this time it's not that easy to have the generic product become available. So by knowing that, we really need to explore many challenges through implementation research. At the same time, we also, like, back of our minds, we also think that it could be too optimistic to think that what we will be doing will bring CAP-LA to be true choice for PrEP in our country, in our region. So it's kind of like it's contrary to when we have oral prep, you know, Anton. At that time, we as implementers we were so interesting, so excited with enthusiasm to roll out this. We know generic product is available, but then the stakeholders in the country feels very reluctant to make PrEP as part of HIV prevention with the conflict around the condom use at that time. But this time, like almost all stakeholders in the country feel very ready, welcoming CAP-LA, but we know that we will not have generic product available for wide scale use. Quite sure to have that. I don't want to be pessimistic here, but it's probably the truth that we have to admit and make better for the future products, if not for this one.
Thanks very much, Natalia. It's really interesting. I mean, we could go on for a long time about availability of these things. I just wanted to give now, and I think that's great insights into how low and middle income countries are going to start moving all this forward, and the challenges for that. Kenneth, the last word for you, because we got to roll this over now. This seminar. We could be talking for a long time. But Kenneth, a quick word from you from Africa.
Yes, one of the key things I wanted to highlight is that there is need to roll out this implementation of CAB in multiple settings, and even within those countries, within different types of facilities, whether it is in family planning, whether it is in MCH, whether it is in pharmacy delivery, so that we can be able to then meet and cross-pollinate the learnings and share with the bigger teams. We have seen a lot of innovations in PrEP delivery. And so if we allow a lot of implementation science projects to roll out for CAB, then we are going to have multiple learnings and shared ideas. Thank you.
Thanks, Kenneth. Well, I'd like to thank all the panelists for a great discussion and for all of you for joining today. And I hope you've, like I have, as I always do, learned a huge amount, and also get my mind working around a lot of the things that have been asked today. I must say that I think that what we've got is this global situation where DSD has been such a success, and that how we're going to use everything that's been very positive from DSD and slot a lot of the long-acting therapies, not just injectables, but other things that are coming on, how we're going to use that for both treatment and PrEP. So we've looked at all what's there. We've looked at there's so many challenges being put out, but we've always had lots of challenges and we've managed to overcome them. And then the next stage is how we get all the evidence, the real world evidence. The evidence from implementation projects rapidly gathered and make sure that if we feel that long acting is the way to go, that all the guidelines can change and this can happen. So it's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much indeed. Now, as mentioned at the beginning of the session, the guest presentations have been recorded and they'll be made available by the IS staff in the coming weeks. There'll be minutes of this round table, which will be shared with the participants, all you participants as well. We'd be grateful if you could spare a couple of minutes, though, to fill in the survey that was posted in the chat by the IS colleagues, because we really value your opinion so much about what the quality of our programs are and where we should go with them all. And we'd really hope to see you all at the next round table. It's going to take place on the 28th of June, and it's focusing on pathways to timely, quality assured, affordable, and available long-acting formulations for prevention and treatment. It's really a little bit of following on from what Natalia said about the enthusiasm, but there's a few steps to go. And with that, I'd like to thank my co-chair, Helen, and again, all the panel, and finally, the IS for in the back of here, making sure that all of this could happen, and to all of you who have joined. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.